Hello, I'm Jenya DeLima. Welcome to Writing and Editing, the author-focused podcast that takes a whole-person approach to everything related to both writing and editing. One of my favorite tropes, no matter the genre, is the family secret, and it's one we can find in the oldest of stories. But how do we write about these in a way that feels new and exciting and doesn't seem to just take over the entire story and go on and on? But also, why do readers still love them? Author Ava Morgyn is joining us to talk about these questions and more. She writes both YA and adult fiction, and her stories always contain at least one secret that's revealed eventually, and all of them are deliciously satisfying to read about. This is Writing About Family Secrets. I am so thrilled to have you here.
Thank you. I'm so delighted to be here.
For listeners who might be unfamiliar with you and your work, would you like to give a little bit of an introduction?
Sure. I'm Ava Morgyn. I am the author of Witches of Bone Hill, which came out last fall, and The Bane Witch, which is coming out in March. I also have two published YA novels, Resurrection Girls and The Salt in Our Blood. Yeah, that's me.
Short and sweet.
Yeah.
So first, why do you think readers are drawn to stories that have family secrets?
I think it speaks to what is, for some people, a very authentic experience of trying to unravel something about themselves through learning more about who they come from. I think it's natural for us to sort of pick apart who our parents were and who our grandparents were and relatives and try to understand those dynamics and sort of as a way of understanding ourselves better, like how we got to be the way that we are or who we are in the world. And so I think that's a really natural thing. And then I also think that there's a thing in each of us that's sort of like sort of a secret desire to find out that we have some juicy power or like we're secretly royal or you know what I mean? Like that secret, that family secret in a way that's like, oh, I'm special all of a sudden. Like I think we all have like a natural craving for that kind of experience. And, most of our family secrets are probably way less exciting than what I get to write about in books. It's usually stuff like, oh, well, my parent, my mom didn't have a father figure, no wonder, blah, blah, blah. Or, you know what I mean? It's things like that. But it's fun to kind of take that and pump it up into this bigger thing. And so for me, that often ends up being a magical slant. I write about witches. I love writing about witches, like my favorite archetype. And or it'll go a very dark way, this sort of very dark secret, or it's a combination of the two sometimes. So,
Yeah, that's something that you do a lot in your books. It's not just that one big explosive secret. It's also a bunch of smaller secrets that sort of overlap.
Yeah.
So how do you find that balance then between these smaller reveals versus that really big one at the end?
I mean, I think I seed the smaller ones in, and I don't always get it right. I remember with The Witches of Bone Hill, having my editor come back and be like, you need to put a couple of more things. Like you're making them wait too long for the payoff. Like you got to give them a little more crumbs on the way there. So it's that kind of crumb trail to the candy house, So I think I try to seed those things in to keep readers intrigued. It's like if you've ever played a video game, if it's too easy, it's boring. And if it's too hard, you lose interest
You
too.
chuck it out
Like
the
there
window.
needs to be that sweet spot of just enough challenge, but like you're still actually accomplishing things. So I feel like it's like that for books with readers. Like they need to be getting enough along the way to keep them tuned in where they don't feel like you're just really making them write it out. And yeah, I usually am trying to hint at what the thing is, and it's not always easy. I have a tendency as a writer to want to hold back too much for too long. Like, and then everything's a big reveal at the very, very end. And I've had to kind of learn, like, you've got to give a little more to your readers along the way.
Yeah, that has to help with the pacing too, just so it isn't just like, okay, we're still moving towards this thing.
Yeah, I have some issues with things like that. Also, I love being ambiguous as a writer, which doesn't always translate well for readers. Readers don't always appreciate ambiguity, and you have to do it sparingly. But again, I have this tendency to want to just like what if it's just all a mystery forever? And like, well, no, people don't really want
I
that.
don't know. There's some TV shows that have pulled that off.
Right. Right.
I would think maybe the genre would have something to do with that too, how well your readers are going to receive something that is ambiguous up until the very end or even at the very end.
Definitely it can. I think genre definitely plays a role, but I'm not really sure what that is in me that enjoys that sense of ambiguity as a writer. I can't even say that I enjoy it as a reader. I certainly have read things that as a reader that have like maybe an ambiguous ending that I like the way they did it, but I've also read things that are ambiguous that leave me frustrated. So I
Right.
try to think about, am I leaving my readers frustrated or am I really serving them something they want?
Yeah, that makes sense. And I can see that too because we talk about this all the time where writing for yourself versus writing for other people. And it's just like anything where now you're going to bring it in front of an audience. It's no longer just about your personal self-fulfillment and what
That's
you get
right.
out of it, right?
That's right. 100%.
When you're plotting this, do you come up with a secret first, or do you come up with something else first and then find your way to it?
I usually come up with the secret first. I usually know what the big thing is going to be first. I may have to sit with it and like map it out a little better. Like I'll have maybe a rough idea, but it might be something that like, okay, you really have to sit and think about the dynamics of this or like how does
Mhm.
this actually all fit? But then I'll then come up with the little things leading the way. And sometimes when I come up with the big secret, there'll be a couple of little revelations that instantly spring to mind, like really quickly, like, oh, this can happen and this can happen. But I'll usually have to come up with some more along the way to kind of feed into that.
When you talked about breadcrumbs, how do you organize them in a way that you ensure you're not leaving some untouched subplot or something that leads like a thread that just goes nowhere?
Yeah, this part is hard. And I find that as I'm getting older, I struggle more with that because I feel like sometimes my brain is trying to hold so many threads and so many pieces at once. Threads is a great allegory for it because you really feel like you're trying to weave this thing together. And I have this tendency to start to bring in so many things. Like in The Witches of Bone Hill, there was just like this enormous family backstory,
Mhm.
much of which didn't even make it into the novel. I have like a ridiculous family tree with names and all kinds of stuff. I could certainly
Feel
go
free
in.
to send that to me.
Yeah, I could definitely go in and do a prequel or something at some point. But it was like it just started to feel so unwieldy sometimes. It was like I am holding so many different pieces and I worry so much that I'm gonna forget something. I'll forget to
Aw.
circle back around and make sure I tied that off. So sometimes, I'm kind of remembering as I go along and I do a lot of note taking. I do sort of what I call like a structure map. Usually I try to do it before the novel, but sometimes I'm filling it in as I go along, or sometimes things change. I might have it mapped out and then it's like things change and I'm like, oh, okay, these points are actually happening this way or at a different time. And then sometimes those are things I have to pick back up in the editing.
Mhm.
Usually, before I send something off to my editor, I've already been over it a few times. And so it might be something that in the editing process, I'm like, oh, yeah, I forgot to like circle back around to this or make sure I really tied that off in a clean way. It's tricky for sure. And the more moving parts you have, the more challenging it becomes.
That leads into something else that I think is a pivotal part of this, which are the characters. It's not just the secret itself, but it's how the characters are influenced because of the secret existing, even when they aren't aware of it.
Yeah.
So, can you tell us how you work on their backstories and then also who they are in the present based on this unearthed hidden knowledge about their
Right.
family?
Well, I definitely think whatever the secret is, which is usually part of my initial premise, shapes conversely then what their backstory is going to be or where we're going to find them when the novel opens. Like with the Witches of Bone Hill, there was this whole thing about them being disconnected from their family when the novel opens, and this entire backstory with their mom and what had happened to her. And so I have to really think about how these things are going to come together. I sort of feel like I start here and then I kind of come up with something here in the backstory, and then I kind of build these things together somewhere in the middle. But I think a lot of times that's what's happening is I have sort of the initial idea, and that's part of the premise. And then that sort of shapes where I want my readers to find this character when the novel opens, and kind of what their backstory is. Like, how does that inform that? Or sometimes I have an idea of a character fairly well shaped out in my head already. Like, sometimes you put them together in bits and pieces, and sometimes they just kind of walk in fully formed or nearly fully formed. They have, like, I'm sort of already have these ideas about them, and I'll sit and have to think about, okay, how does this fit, like, with what the premise is? Like, how do I tie these things together where it makes sense that maybe they have these personality traits? You have to really consider the character arc as well. The secret has to have purpose and meaning for how it helps this character make a complete arc and kind of develop this new part of themselves or reach this new level of growth.
You sort of already answered this, but just going even deeper with that question, if we use Cordelia and Eustace as the example here, they've both experienced very similar events, obviously, since their sisters grew up the same way. But they take drastically different approaches to how they confront this and also how they feel about it.
Yeah.
And I think it's important then to also talk about how you let their individual personalities shine through everything that they've been through, and also show that we're not just a result of these experiences alone.
Yeah, I think that's really reflective kind of my own experience. I have a lot of sisters. I'm the baby of the family, but they're all like, I have a full sister and a half sister and stepsisters, right? So it's sort of blended family situation. And there are things that we shared growing up, and there are things that we had very wildly different experiences of growing up. How we kind of have reacted and responded to all this stuff can be so different from one of us to the next. But I love all my sisters, and my sisters love me. And I don't have, I might have come out of a certain situation very differently, or I saw it very differently. I experienced it very differently than maybe one of them did. I think I have a lot of, and they do as well, a lot of give and understanding for the way that these things impact us so uniquely, even if, we're growing up in the same family, or, we're put through some of the same experiences, in some cases, some of the same traumas, or in some cases, maybe something landed as a trauma on somebody, but not somebody else. So it's kind of fascinating how we respond to stimuli as human beings, and how it shapes our personalities. Especially with Cordelia and Eustace, I really wanted to have that sense of opposition. I felt like Eustace's approach being so different from Cordelia's would be important to her character arc. I really kind of tried to surround her a little bit with characters that were approaching life from a very different way. Gordon sort of does that as well for her. He's really coming at things from a very different way, almost in an opposites attract kind of scenario, or just that thing of like, she needed that exposure to people who were really doing it differently, and it's working for them in its own way, you know what I mean, to kind of help her loosen up a little bit and begin to move past the fear and the trauma and find some acceptance for these parts of herself and things that she's been through. Like, I'm so fascinated by female relationships. I love reading novels that are like sisters or friends or toxic friendships or mother-daughter scenarios or whatever. I just think those dynamics can be very complex in a way that's juicy and really fun to mine as a writer.
Exactly. Yeah, one thing that I love about what you do with your work too is that it's so easy to just assume that this person who's come before us hasn't had a life that's as interesting as ours, or that they won't really understand where we're coming from, because how could they have possibly gone through anything close or similar? And yet you show that that's so often not the case at all. And that maybe, again, like Cordelia a little bit in the beginning, we are so focused on ourselves and our own circumstances that we overlook that.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's part of the maturing experience. Like, as a child, our parents are just these sort of, we have this idea that they can kind of do anything. You know what I mean? Like, you kind of grow up and you start to realize, like, oh, my parents are flawed, and they're kind of just like I am, and they were figuring it out along the way. And maybe they made mistakes, or maybe they were, by the time I came into the picture, they were dealing with their own traumas, with their own issues. It's this thing that sort of reveals itself to you in layers over time as we mature. And also, for me, I definitely had experiences like that, like kind of family secret kind of things. I mean, not like, hey, we're all ancient Nordic witches, which would have been amazing. I would have loved that. But, things I remember learning along the way, like finding out that my grandmother wasn't actually my biological grandmother, and,
Yeah.
just these kind of fascinating things that would pop up, and it changes how you look at your family and your parents. And I lost my mom fairly young. I was in my 20s. We had a very close but also very contentious relationship. And I think so often, like, I wish she was still here so that I could let her know, like, how much I've grown and how I view her. And, I'm older now. I'm so much more forgiving. Like, I get it. Kids are hard. And you know what I mean? Like, I miss being able to say those kind of things to her and appreciate her in the ways that I've come to appreciate her as an older woman, and learning over the years, and having more compassion and empathy and understanding for what she must have experienced and what, her life had been like. And yeah, I don't even know if I remember the original question. I get off on a tangent.
That's okay, because sometimes the tangents, I think, reveal things that are most of interest, and
Yeah.
to also go off on a tangent from this entire theme, but I
Yeah,
can then see how even bringing in some of those paranormal or supernatural aspects would be cathartic in a way, because, being able to say these things to someone who's no longer here, for instance, in a way that
for
we
sure.
can't in real life.
I agree. I think that's one of the wonderful things about fiction, is it really allows us to lean into experiences that we might never get in real life. I think, we get to really have these experiences that we're not going to ever get to have, maybe, but through a story, we get to have it.
So you do this a little bit with the Witches of Bone Hill, and that is, what are your thoughts about using a non-linear structure to bring about this revelation or to tell these stories?
I mean, I'm open to all kinds of stuff structure wise, but I have sort of, I don't know, I've gotten a little more rigid about how I want my things to fall, like how I want the dominoes to fall. You know what I
Mhm.
mean? I do a lot of backstory, like bringing in backstory and kind of revealing things through backstory. But ultimately, even when I'm doing that, I'm sort of following a sort of typical structure map that I think works well for storytelling and works well for readers. But just personally, as a writer, I mean, I had one novel that my agent shopped. She was so excited about, and I loved it. But I mean, I wrote it like, the structure is so not traditional at all.
Mhm.
It's so all over the place, which I kind of just enjoyed so much. And she really loved it, but it was, I think it got attention, but it just, at the end of the day, and we've talked about it since then, a few times. And every time I'm like, I have to redo it with a more traditional structure, I think, So structure is one of those things where it's like, from a creative perspective, it can feel really good to break away from it. But I think for readers, if you move too far away, then it really kind of, their experience of it suffers.
It reminds me of the analogy you gave earlier about the video games and it being too easy or too hard. And I
Yeah.
playing with the structure maybe a little too creatively will then fall into it's too hard.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. They start to lose sense of where the story is going. And it's easy as the writer, for me anyway, to kind of forget, like, I have it all in my head, but they don't,
Right?
right? So I have to remind myself sometimes, like, they don't know all the things are coming. So you have to do it in a certain way that you're leading them through that.
Well, going back to the one of the very first questions, and that is, how do you make these stories still feel new and like there's something the reader hasn't seen before, even if you're using secrets that have been shared in lots of other pieces?
Um,
Not that you've done that, but
I mean, I probably have. I mean, I think, like, I come from a witch family, or magical family is pretty standard. Like, that gets passed around a lot. There's nothing super new about that. But I think you always try to bring in a new element or a new twist. I really feel like with creative work, the saying that there's nothing new under the sun is pretty true. I don't know how much we're really reinventing the wheel, but we're always trying to put our unique spin on it. And I think you do that through maybe unique details. For example, in The Witches of Bone Hill, having them come from this Nordic tradition that isn't something I've seen written about a lot in books, and tying in a little bit of that historical truth into the novel, into a novel also that's like set in Connecticut, like it's just that kind of thing. I think you play with the details, and then I think too you can differentiate that in ways like with voice. I think voice is huge. It's like probably my favorite thing, and one of the biggest factors on any book I read is, do I like the voice? If I love the voice that this author is writing in, I'll read them. They can talk about anything. This book can go nowhere, but if I love the voice, I'll just keep reading it. And so there are things like that you can play with. Voice is so unique to each author, and even from book to book, it can shift.
Yeah.
So I think that's another way that you really differentiate and put a unique stamp on something,
I was going to say one thing too that I think you do really effectively that helps pull people in before they even get to that secret is that you give people these relatable real life problems first.
Yeah.
So it's like you're almost invested in seeing how that plays out. And so
Yeah.
at least in the beginning of that first act, the big, huge secret is almost on the back burner. Even in the
Yeah.
reader's mind, you're like, whoa, are they going to be able to get out of this financial difficulty?
Right.
Will she be able to show her ex he's a total jerk? And will
Yeah.
he get his comeuppance?
Yeah, right. I mean, those things I think actually ground the story, especially if you're writing speculative fiction in some way. Giving your characters relatable problems grounds the story so that readers can relate and invest emotionally in these characters. And something similar in The Bane Witch, when the novel opens, that character is, escaping an abusive marriage. And that's a very real thing that a lot of people deal with. So being able to give your characters kind of real life problems or real life issues, so I think doing those kind of things is what really grounds the story and helps your readers invest emotionally and relate to your characters and what they're going through.
Well, before we close, do you have any upcoming projects you can share with us?
I don't think so. I do have The Bane Witch coming out March 18th. I'm excited for readers to get a hold of this book, probably more so than I was with Witches of Bone Hill. I invested so much in this one, and I think I'm just really excited about the idea of a breed of witch we haven't seen before. They function in a totally different way, and I got to play with research that was really interesting. It was so much fun, but I also really gave this character a really difficult and challenging start in this story. She's really escaping a horrible situation, and I tried as much as possible to bring some gravity to that, and so that readers could really cheer for her along the way. But I love the language of it. I love the setting, and I'm so proud of Piers, that the main character. I just think she overcomes so much, and she embraces this intensely powerful and strong, but also morally ambiguous and what some could say dark side of herself that to me really reflects kind of, as a normal person, embracing our shadow side, like learning like, oh, we have these darker aspects, and how do I integrate that and still be a functioning and contributing member of society, right?
Still go to the PTA meeting this week.
Yeah, right. I can't run anybody over with my car on the way there. So I'm really excited about that one. I do have another novel that I did turn in, and it hasn't been announced. So I can't say too much, but I am like slowly leaking little details out, like
like right now.
Yeah, like right now. So I don't know how much I can say. I don't want to give the title or anything like that, but I will say it's another witch-centered adult novel. It deals with like cult behavior and chaos magic, which was just fun and different. And that character also has a multi-generational history and a very sordid, tragic backstory.
Oh, who doesn't?
Novel definitely opens on her being at her lowest point and then kind of moving up from there. And in part, it's through her connection to these really challenging people, and also her connection to the love interest. And it's set in Seattle. So it's the first time I think I've set one. No, that's not true. Salt in Our Blood was in New Orleans. Resurrection Girls was Houston suburbs. But in my first adult novel set in a real place, and I brought in a little bit of Seattle history to it, which I didn't originally intend, but it just happened in the course of research. And so that was really fun to play with, and I'm excited about it. Seattle's such a groovy city. I've been there once. I've not gotten to experience it as much as I would like, but it was a fun place. If you're going to pick a city, I think it's a really cool city to set a novel. So I really enjoyed. Setting is huge for me. I love whether it's a real setting or one that I've made up. It just plays such an important role. It's almost a separate character. Mm-hmm. So I really enjoyed that for sure.
Well, thank you again so much.
Thanks, Jinya. I really enjoyed this.
I did too. And thank you for listening, and be sure to check out the show notes for additional information, including Ava's social media links. So if you want to keep an eye out for these breadcrumbs about this wink wink book that might or might not exist, you can follow her there. And then please join me next week when Brian Van Dyke will be joining us to talk about When Life Imitates Art. Thanks again.